Okay. I can't tell if everyone can see us talking now, but I believe they can. So I will just say good evening to everyone, and welcome to our Susty Summit virtual webinar. And of course, happy Earth Day. I hope that you have all had a fantastic time celebrating. So I'm just going to give it like 2 minutes. I can see the participants climbing up and up the numbers. So we'll just maybe give it like a minute more. I'm not entirely sure what you can see, so you might just have to stare at our faces just for
I hope you appreciate our funky backgrounds. We really put a lot of effort into the styling for this Zoom.
They are quite coordinated, actually. We've got some pinks in there, some like tropical green vibes going on. I'm loving it. So just so that everyone is aware, there is there are a few functions that you can play with as we go along. So there is the chat function where you can send us a message or just say hi, you know, where you're from, whatever, just, you know, give us a bit of love on the chat. Equally, there is an official Q&A function. Now we have a Q&A section at the end of the presentation where you'll be able to ask questions, but if stuff comes on or if stuff comes up as you're going along, then just pop it in there and we will try to get to as many as we possibly can. Oh, lots of love coming in on the chat already. It's quite distracting though. I'm like trying to like read that with one eye. Well. So yes, and then we also have a poll function that you can use at any point throughout, which are just around yeah, just some like fun little interactive things if you get bored of us talking, but hopefully you won't, because we've got some great content. And yes, we will get started in like a minute or so.
Hope everyone's having a lovely Earth Day.
Yeah. Oh, we've got some very nice comments coming in. We're very appreciating. My mum's just said hi. Hi, mum.
Hi.
We've got all the parents on today, as we were discussing earlier.
It's nice because there's so many people that normally can't join us for Susty Summits because they're in London, which we are definitely, you know, after this situation, we'll definitely be looking at making them more regional. But it is so great to have so many international people as well. It's just, yeah, great that we can share the content that we work so hard on producing a bit wider this time.
Yes. Cool. Okay, so I think we are 5 minutes in. So should we get started? Should we just do it? All right, we're gonna do it. Okay, so I am going to share my screen with everyone. I have closed everything, but who knows what might pop up. So apologies if you get my WhatsApps coming in or whatever. Well, let's just pray that it doesn't happen. It's so embarrassing.
Yeah, don't text Elsie that knows
yeah,
that.
Don't text me. Everyone that I know is watching this anyway, so it should be fine. And yeah, like hoping that digitally this all goes well, but obviously, you know, our fate is in the hands of Zoom at the moment. So who knows? Fingers crossed. I think it should all be smooth. All right, sharing the screen. It's coming now. Wait. All right. So let's put this into a slideshow and get started. I'll minimize our little faces because I think you can all just see our faces anyway. So I'm just going to put that down there. Uh-oh, no, it's doing its own thing. So I'm just going to go into this full screen. Cool. All right. Well, welcome everyone to Susty Summit number 6. So we are super excited to have you all here. We're super excited that we still managed to do this by the power of technology. So today we are focusing on Earth Day because it is, of course, Earth Day. So we wanted to take 50 minutes to celebrate 50 years of Earth Day. And really what we're going to be focused on tonight is how you can make Earth Day every day. So looking at the highest impact areas that you can personally change and personally kind of implement for positive change for the environment. We just a quick brief intro on us, if you don't know who we are or what we do. So myself and Dominica are the co-founders of Bybee. We're a climate conscious skincare brand. We started the Susty Summit actually from our offices in London, where the first one we packed in like 30 people into our tiny little office. And really the idea behind the Susty Summit was let's empower people with information. Let's provide like solution-driven information that's really useful for people. Let's drive awareness of the climate situation. And also let's open the doors to what we're trying to do at Bybee, and be super honest and transparent and open with you guys about the challenges that we face trying to navigate this world as a sustainable or more sustainable brand. So that's a bit of background on Bybee. Myself and Dominica don't come from environmental backgrounds, so this is all new to us. We're literally learning every day. So what we wanted to do to make tonight really impactful was call upon some experts in the field. And experts we certainly do have. So excited for our speakers tonight, and I think Dom and I are just really conscious that we don't want to talk that much. We want to hand over to these guys as soon as possible. So we've got Lucy Siegle, who is a TV journalist. She's a published author. She's a specialist in the environment. And we've also got Catherine Foster, who is a program coordinator at Project Drawdown, which is a climate solutions kind of initiative. And they both have such an amazing wealth of experience in the field. So we're super excited to pass over to them. So just quickly what you can expect for tonight. So we will do some quick intros and kind of some setting the scene, looking at choosing our future, or the future that we can choose moving forward. Then we'll pass over to Lucy to talk about kind of the storytelling and narrative around the climate situation. Catherine will talk about Project Drawdown. And then we're going to run through some facts and hacks, which we'll try and get through quite quickly, so that we can get to a Q&A, a juicy Q&A at the end. So passing over to Dominique.
Sorry, I started talking and then I was on mute. Oh, I'm just living the Zoom stereotype. So today is Earth Day, and for us, obviously, that's a momentous occasion for communities in the world to unite and think about what's happening to the environment. But actually, the climate crisis that we're in, we're obviously in other crises at the moment, but we're still really passionate and really committed to sharing, awareness around the climate crisis. And I think for that, for us, that means Earth Day should actually be every day, and we shouldn't be choosing one date of the year to celebrate the earth and all that it gives back to us. And actually, we should be thinking about that consistently every day. And that's really the theme of today's presentation, is how that you can implement Earth Day into your everyday life. So we're in a current crisis at the moment, and I think some of the positives that we've really seen, both from a business and a personal perspective, is that despite being apart, we are more connected than ever. And I think that's so exciting that we live in an age where we're able to rally big communities of people in a digital space, because it means that we can continue to have collective impact. We can use our phenomenal power to incite change. And actually what we've really learned is that we can adapt really quickly as a species. We're hugely nimble, we're hugely ambitious, and we're able to make change really quickly. And actually we're super powerful when we act together and we're really collaborative. And I think these are all things that maybe we've been a little bit more trepidatious about when thinking about the climate crisis. Can we really rally together as a community, as a world, as a global population, and make change? But I think the current crisis around COVID-19 has showed us is that when there's a will and there's a passion, and there's a preservation at stake, we can actually really rally together. And I think that's hugely exciting and really, really powerful. So we found some interesting stats, and I think this is just really showing the impact and the positive impact of COVID-19, in that only 9% of the UK actually want to return to normal life. So this is a real opportunity to mark some serious change. COVID-19 will end. We will come out of the current crisis and we will recover as an economy, as a population, it's been a really challenging time for a lot of people, but we will come out of this, you know, and it's really positive to see that. But we've still got a crisis that's continuing to ongo. And, you know, at the moment, we're able to now really make a decisive decision around how we live our lives post-COVID. And it's great to see that so many people in the UK and hopefully worldwide want to start making some really strong changes.
Yeah, and I think like we've heard a lot about, you know, the new normal, that term being thrown around a lot. And actually we all have the power to decide what that new normal looks like. And that can be a really pivotal and crucial moment for our environment. So actually, you know, as with everything that happens in our earth, like all of this stuff goes hand in hand. So I guess we're focused on framing this situation as what decisions can we make as individuals to kind of like move into the new normal, and drive really like positive, impactful change. So yeah, this is what we're here to share, hacks that you need to know on how to do this, so that we can together make sure that Earth Day is every day, and drive collective change. So just like a really brief overview of the situation, I think, you know, everybody is well aware of climate change at the moment, and that human activity has driven enormous amounts of carbon emission, which is causing the planet to heat up, basically. So there's a number of scientific studies into this, and obviously we'll pass over to Lucy and Catherine, who will be able to talk about this in way more detail than we will. But the kind of like overarching message is we need to halve our carbon emissions by 2030 for the planet to be able to begin to kind of like safeguard against any critical impacts. And whilst this can sound quite kind of like abstract, and we also know that the responsibility lies very heavily with large corporates and governments, we also as individuals can start to take some responsibility for what we can do to drive our own change. And really what tonight's presentation is personal impact. So we're not too focused on, we're definitely not saying that, you know, corporates shouldn't change, because they absolutely should, but we're focused on what we can do as individuals. And really that is about how do we lessen our carbon footprint, essentially. So here are some stats on what a carbon footprint looks like typically within the UK. So kind of running the numbers, what we need to aim towards is reducing our 8.34 tonnes at the moment by 3.34 tonnes to hit that halving global emissions by 2030 that we talked about earlier. So there is some work to do for us all as individuals, and it may not feel like the small things that you do on a day-to-day basis are making change, but I think what we're here to say is they are, and if we all do them together, we can help bring us forward and hit some of these stats that we really need to, that it's actually now getting to a very crucial and critical point for our environment. So I'm going to hand over to Lucy, because I feel like this is getting a bit techie for me. So I'm out. No, so I will stop sharing, Lucy, so that we are just on your face, and hand over to you to kind of like, yeah, talk a little bit more about the narrative and the communication.
Sure, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Happy Earth Day. Although every day is Earth Day, as we know. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And one of the things that I was really excited by was the opportunity to talk a little bit about storytelling and communicating, because climate change might be happening fast, but the story can change. And actually, that is one of the best tools that we have. So humans talk to humans. The way that we interconnect, the way that we interact is very much about storytelling, whether it's our own story, whether it's other people's, imagining yourselves in someone else's shoes. That's kind of how we communicate. Some of those stories might be really stripped back. Some of them might be quite statistic heavy, but they're still stories. And I think that sometimes when you talk about the communication piece around climate and nature, and you call it storytelling, people can get a little bit worried about that, because it sounds like it's fiction, or that you are suggesting that it is in some way sort of frivolous. And I have a river out there, by the way, so I look out there a lot. And it's really like, it's not that at all. Storytelling is a huge, huge power. It doesn't mean that it's not evidence-based. In fact, all of our storytelling around nature and climate has to be evidence-based. I believe really, really strongly in that. I do not believe in the healing power of crystals myself. That doesn't mean that I don't collaborate with people who do, because I think it's important to be a really broad church, and they may be picking up on something that I have missed. But I do need evidence when I cover a story, when I write about a story. And we have a lot of evidence, some of which you've already heard. So I want to start talking about language, and I want to start a little bit talking about that evidence. So one of the best things that you can do if you are confronted with somebody who is a climate denier, although they are declining in number, which is good, or a skeptic, they're really deniers, they're just less vociferous, or somebody who, you know, is liable to cast this as an irrelevance or a side issue. And almost like withhold the microphone from you. So the first thing is, how do you get the microphone, right? And some people have really struggled with this. And it's harder to get the microphone traditionally if you're a woman, if you're an ethnic minority, if you are not an extrovert. And I say this knowing that I am an extrovert. So we haven't been very good at opening up nature and climate dialogue and passing the microphone around. This is a fictitious microphone, by the way. It's not like a real one. You don't have to wait. Like if you're thinking, God, I never got the microphone. It's not a real thing. But we haven't been very good at sharing it. So we have had a lack of diversity in the arguments. You're also less liable to have the microphone if you're from the global south. So the global north dominates proceedings. And all of these things have happened because we have a structural inefficiency. I like to call it an inefficiency about who we listen to and when we listen to them. And partly that is to do with the rate at which we operate. So we kind of hurtle through life. We give very little space, ironically, to the issues that matter most. And on Earth Day, there is no better day than to think about how much the Earth sustains us. I mean, it literally is everything. So, you know, from breathable air to drinkable water to healthy soils, to the regenerative capacity of planet Earth is awesome and incredible, right? And I know Catherine will be able to help with some figures in the way that Project Drawdown has very cleverly kind of divvied that up. But we are really pushing the Earth into its like grey margins of where it can operate well. We're putting so much pressure on that we know that we are reaching these tipping points, and not just in climate, though climate is the one that we talk about a lot, but also in nature, which is what I call biodiversity. Okay, we also have to remember we're not the only species here. But one of the problems is that we haven't been giving enough room, either cognitively, we haven't been thinking about this issue enough, and we haven't been giving enough airtime to this issue. And that's something that I personally have struggled with. So I've been operating in this space for, you know, nearly 20 years. I've been trying to talk about planet Earth, and I've been trying to talk about designs, ingredients, recipes, which are driven by Earth logic. So putting the needs of the Earth first, because if you do that, then you multi-solve. If you put the Earth first in your thinking and you prioritize ecosystem behavior, then you're automatically sorting out a whole load of problems. If you're too human-centric and you put what I would call sort of fake needs first, so if you think about consumerism, for example, that is a manufactured concept and desire. And a lot of us are finding that out, because I'm, you know, sure that I'm not the only one who during lockdown is looking around and going, why have I got so much stuff? Why have I many clothes? When was I going to wear that? You know, and I'm a sustainable advocate, so you know, I can only imagine people who don't have those kind of barriers put on their consumption. So some of those are real manufactured concepts, and they get more airtime than earth logic and the logic of living in harmony with ecosystems which sustain us. And that is absolutely bonkers. So Earth Day is the one day of the year traditionally which has acted as a corrective. And the idea is that all day everything's earth focused, and it should be that you use earth logic. But it's obviously, as has already been pointed out, really dumb just to do that one day of the year. And it's also not enough, because it's not good enough to focus 1 day or 2 days of the year on cutting emissions, because the international climate regime and the numbers that we need to get to mean that we need to be doing it every single day. So I'm sure we've got people joining us from lots of different territories, but in the UK at the moment, one of the things that we are doing with COVID-19 is that our government holds a daily press briefing. They vary in their efficacy and usefulness, let's be honest. However, imagine if they held a daily climate briefing. Imagine if every day we had a point at which a large proportion of the viewing public, and it's not everybody by any means that tunes in to COVID-19 briefings, and you have to have lots of different communication strategies because we have so many different types of media and so many different ways of consuming media these days. But imagine if there was a centralized point, and imagine some of the things that we covered off. Imagine if we said the temperature every day, and we said the temperature today and the temperature 10 years ago. Wow, that would be like an amazing point, because everyone would go, well, the temperature's really much higher today. You know, usually statistically that would be what's happening. Imagine if we then moved on and we had the Minister for Energy. We probably don't even have a Minister for Energy. We should. The Minister for Energy stepped forward, and he said, or she said, God, it could even be a she, imagine that. And she said, oh, so today 46%, this is not real by the way, 46% of the UK's electricity was generated by renewable energy today. And you go, oh, right, okay. So I want to get that temperature down, and I want to get that renewable energy number up. Imagine that. But this is the kind of thing that we really should be doing. And we need to have more places to go to get this kind of information. And we need to be giving this kind of airtime and focus to this issue, because arguably people have been very quick to respond to the idea that we are in a crisis right now. I mean, if you haven't got it by now, you're in trouble. You know, we're locked down in our homes. Normal life has stopped as we know it. There's all these kind of big fiscal packages around the economy. You know, everything has changed at this point, and it's all we can think about. But we are not at all grasping the fact that we're in a climate emergency. Not for 1 minute. And partly that is a communications failure. And one of the problems is that we just haven't given it enough airtime. We haven't given it enough brain space, enough cognitive space, because we are distracted and preoccupied by lots of other things, understandably. So one of the things that I really wanted to say to you tonight is, now is the time to get granular about this subject. And I know, because if I use myself as an example, I was always a little bit afraid of being too granular about it, because I didn't want to be really, really boring. I mean, I'm boring enough about things, but I didn't want to get really, really dull. I didn't want to, you know, and I have kept my conversation quite superficial about some of these subjects for a long time. And I now realize that that was actually a bit of an act of cowardice, if I'm being completely honest, because what has changed about the way that I communicate in the very recent past, even though I've been writing about this for a very long time, is that I have become braver and more radical about what I say. And that's not to say that I didn't write about facts before, because facts is not the issue. What I wasn't necessarily doing was connecting the facts with my emotions and how I felt about things. And that is a really brave point. And I think we need to connect the head and the heart much more when we communicate these subjects. And I'm not talking about being overly emotional or incredibly dramatic, but just talking about things like absence, like when a species is lost, how does that make us feel? How does it make us feel? And we hear this a lot from young people, actually, who've been incredibly open and honest about how the climate emergency will affect them, led by Greta Thunberg, obviously. And you know, that is a very kind of raw emotion. And that's one of the reasons that I felt that I needed to step up, because I'm having conversations with very young people, like young teenagers, and they are telling me they're in extreme distress. And my emotional level's up here and theirs is down there. And I'm going, yeah, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Blah, 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 blah. That is not the way to behave. I had to be a lot more authentic, and I had to be as radical and as honest in my emotion as they were. So when I did that, my communication started to change and open up. And I think it's about being much more open. I'd like to talk briefly about language. Language is very, very important. I'm not talking about the sort of language that's incredibly guarded and closed, again, closed versus open. I'm not talking about language that allows you to distance yourself from the crisis, climate crisis I'm talking about at the moment. I'm talking about precise language, which doesn't undermine the severity. So it's honest and truthful and open. And I'm sure a lot of people are aware of this, but in May 2019, The Guardian, which I know because I'd worked for The Guardian previously for a long time, and I know that they've been talking about doing this for a long time, decided to make some pivotal language tweaks in the way that we talked about nature and climate. And just to run through a couple of those, the most obvious one is that instead of climate change, the preferred term is now climate emergency. Instead of global warming, the preferred term is global heating. And the reason why those kind of changes were made was to be more scientifically precise, but to communicate clearly on how important these issues were. So climate change sort of offered a slight complacency because, oh, the climate's changing. Yeah, we know it's changing, it's fine. And it also offered space for denialists to come in and say, oh, the climate's always changing, it always has. So some of these changes they were multi-solving, which is a word that is quite an ugly word. But I think it's really, really helpful, because I think that we should be looking, especially as we come out of lockdown, out of this crisis, we should be looking at how we change from what we've learned, how we use what we've learned on different issues to multi-solve. So not just looking in siloed way, how do we decarbonize? But how do we decarbonize, but how do we also solve a social problem? Like, how do we make energy affordable for those who are the most marginalized? And that's another big theme of storytelling for me now, which I think is really, really important. When you're thinking of the story that you're telling, whether it be in collaboration with a brand, your own story, or taking a world event and putting it through the lens of whatever platform you use, or if you write for a particular organization or whatever, I think that a really, really important discipline now is to ask yourself how the most marginalized person that you've ever talked to about this subject reacted and spoke about that issue. So if it was renewable energy, I'm mentioning renewable energy a lot tonight, but if it was renewable energy, did they say to you that they'd never heard of it? Or were they in opposition to it because they know someone that works in a coal-fired power station? Like, what was their biggest fear and hope for that subject? And I think it's really, really important to check in with different people who have very different perceptions, because it's really, really important that when we tell these stories about nature and climate, that we go out of our bubble. And sometimes you need to go out of your way to go out of that bubble. And weirdly, at the moment, although we're locked down and we're communicating by all these different platforms and all these different methods, I'm actually finding it easier to go out of my bubble than I did before. And I think it's really interesting that when we're out and about and we're busy going to all of these events and panel discussions and whatever, we quite often just versions of ourselves and have conversations. So we're in another way that you can obviously do that is by looking at lots of different media and being really agile and like versatile about your media as well. So if you always listen to the same radio station of a morning, just have a flick round and listen to some other points of view. And you know what? Sometimes they can be hard to listen to if you're not used to them, but phone-in stations are really, really kind of important. And what you should really try and do is to try and curb your reflexive reaction, especially to people who seem in opposition, and especially to people who want their normal life back. I think we mentioned there was 9% of people polled. Those 9% of people are going to be really important, and they're going to be really vociferous. And the question is, what do they like about that? Why do they want it back? So we need to be really really try and engage with that audience as well. So I think all of that is very important. The last thing that I want to talk about is creativity as well. So a lot of the time, because climate change, I'll just use that word, the climate emergency can be quite technically focused and quite based on numbers, and is obviously evidence-led and science-led. We can be a little bit buttoned up in how we react to it. And I think a really helpful process when you're trying to talk about communication and free yourself up to tell a story in a particular way is to think of yourself a bit more like an artist who makes work. And a really, really creative response to a really serious issue is absolutely fine. Some of the best responses I've seen have actually been comedic and really, really hilarious, because they just open a window and they like flick a switch for a certain audience. Always try and be really clear in what you're communicating, but don't be afraid of tools like humor or being really, really creative. And if you feel really buttoned up, and you can almost get a sense of stage fright when you're writing or communicating or broadcasting about something so important, free yourself up by making a crazy little bit of work, like a little film, a meme. We need more memes, by the way. We really do need more memes, because some of this stuff is just really chunky and can seem quite abstract, and memes are a great way of making it travel and really crystallizing your ideas. But to free yourself up, give yourself a little bit of time to do a project. I don't know how you're going to do this or what it's going to be, but a really crazy little creative project about nature and climate, just to free yourself up and to give you an idea of how an artist might communicate. I'm not saying that's going to be your life's work forever, but I really think it's important not to be restricted or constrained by the topic. Okay, so those are my kind of takeaways, because I don't want to go on too long, and I probably have already. So free yourself up. Be really granular, read as much as you can, and there's some incredible, amazing commentators around at the moment, and I'm talking about people like Mary Hegler in the States. If you don't follow her on Twitter, you should follow her. Lots of new voices coming into this space, and it's not just the old Enviro boys talking about being out there saving the world, all the adventurers. You know, I think look out, lots of different commentators from lots of different positions and lots of different vantage points. Look at the science that's just really digestible. Project Drawdown is a really great example of that. Crystallize, put numbers on it, easy to follow, and free yourself up. Express this in whatever way you can and wherever you want. There is no right or wrong way of telling these stories. And finally, if you have any questions and you ever want to know something more specific, please just ask me. You know, I'm on Twitter at Lucy Siegle, and I'm on Instagram, The Seagull. I thought it was a joke when I signed up, and I didn't use my own name. But anyway, you can find me, and please ask me any questions, and happy Earth Day.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was amazing. And the Q&A function is live. So we have a Q&A section at the end. So if you have any questions for Lucy or Catherine, or for both, please pop them in as we go along, and then we will address at the end during our Q&A session. And we do have great time for that. So please throw in some weighty questions.
I forgot to put the poll live, so I'll do that now. I don't know how these things work, guys. I'm just launching a poll, so I don't know what this has it. I don't know what it's doing, but feel free to just, has it now just gone?
It's there.
All right, cool.
A personal CO2 reduction pledge.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, people are okay. Great.
Oh, we can't vote.
While you vote, yes, that was great. Thank you so much, Lucy. And I hope that everybody found that interesting, no matter what field or background you come from. You know, if we're all here to kind of show up and have a voice in this conversation, then we need to, know and understand how we do that. Cool. I don't know what to do with this poll, really.
I just closed it because I can't vote, so.
Oh, I can close it out of the way and I'll just keep it going. Yeah, that's fine. Great.
So next we have Catherine. So if we want to draw the slides back up, and then Catherine from Drawdown, yeah, super excited to have you here. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, I'm just wondering who, oh yeah, Elsie's doing it. Great. We're back. We're back with the colourful slides. All right, over to Catherine.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I also want to say thank you to Lucy for really leading a wonderful conversation on communication. It's one of our key principles as well at Project Drawdown. It's something we really strive for. So I'm Catherine Foster. I'm the Research Program Coordinator at Project Drawdown. I have the wonderful opportunity of working with a lot of great science communicators and climate researchers around the globe. It's really what our work is focused on. Project Drawdown is a research and communications nonprofit. So our focus is really inspired by the big question, is drawdown possible? And drawdown is the point in time at which atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases start to peak and then decline. It's probably the most science that I'll talk about in this presentation because it's really not my background. My background is more from environmental policy and urban forestry. I spent a wonderful year planting trees. But when we think about drawdown, drawdown is that indicator or that end goal that we're really looking for. It's the sign that our carbon and climate policies have really had an impact and that this crisis, as we talk about it, has a solution. When we think about the solutions to climate change, we need to think of not just the solutions that immediately come to mind. So often people will think of renewable energy or maybe converting to solar panels, but there's a wide variety of solutions that are applicable to drawdown. And when we're aiming for drawdown, the idea is to bring in all these solutions together. The benefit of our organization, and one of the great qualities, the reason for why I work there, is that we work with research partners from around the world to really collate all this information together. As Lucy was talking about, there's a lot of voices that don't get included in the climate space. And our goal is to include a lot of these voices and data into the conversation. When we look at these solutions, we don't want a nonprofit that's headquartered in California to be really leading the conversation at a regional level. We can know, for instance, the global implications of a solution, but when it comes to the regional impact or who's going to be including these solutions in their policies, the regional focus really comes more into play. That's why our research fellows are from around the world as opposed to just America. When we look at what drawdown looks like in the future, that's also an opportunity for us to address what the future holds for us. And it's also an opportunity, as has been talked about with COVID, for us to reprioritize our interests. What do we want our future to look like? How dependent do we want to be on fossil fuels? Well, the answer to that is we can't be dependent on fossil fuels, but there's also cascading benefits that come from these solutions that perhaps haven't been included yet. So if you'd like to go to the next slide, Elsie. So this is a brief breakdown of some of our research so far. We came out with a book in 2017 on some of these research results, and it has been updated this year in the Drawdown 2020 review. And if you look, this is a perhaps very colorful demonstration of the multitude of sectors that we do our research in. And the size of the circle indicates how significant that solution will have in reaching drawdown at the end. I should note that we do analyze 2 scenarios. In order to get to drawdown, we have what we determine to be a 1.5 degree scenario, and then we have a 2 degree scenario. I won't focus so much on the numbers here. What I think is really interesting is how different sectors will play a role in getting to that 1.5 degree world. Obviously, electricity is pretty key here. So this is shifting to renewables, addressing electricity efficiencies, also addressing our transport needs and our building materials. The other big one that perhaps people don't think about as much is land and agriculture. So these are things like addressing our diets, perhaps not going vegan or vegetarian, but just reducing our meat consumption as a whole, because that has significant carbon footprints that we can't account for. The other big one there, and I know this is going to be addressed later, is food waste. So food waste is a big carbon footprint because it not only has its own footprint in its production, but certain inefficiencies that arrive from not using the foods or not appropriately disposing of it. There's more research on the website. I do encourage you to check it out. Each solution has its own technical summary of how this number, for instance, on the carbon side or also the financial side, is computed. And what you may notice as well is there's other solutions that are included here because they have an indirect impact on the climate. One that stands out for a lot of people is health and education. When we talk about health and education, we're talking about equitable access to education and reproductive health care at a global scale, because providing these services has an impact on a woman's ability to choose how her family is being laid out over the years. It also impacts when she has children and how many, which eventually has an impact on the population. That being said, with climate solutions, it's always important to consider that there are cascading benefits to these solutions beyond just the immediate environmental impacts. Benefits to society, economics, benefits to how we think about our everyday interactions with each other, and how we sort of build our lives going forward. I want to touch upon also the aspect that Lucy brought up about language. So we think climate change is, yes, a crisis in many ways, but also an opportunity to rebuild our futures. And when we talk about optimism, that's really what we're trying to bring forth, is perhaps a realistic optimism about what the future holds. And then my last slide is just a brief quote that I wanted to leave you with. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and I won't read it to you because you can all take it in. But the idea here is to really think about your individual action contributing to something greater. It's why I work in climate change. It's why I really dedicated my short career to it so far, because individual action just becomes something greater than itself. And when we're thinking about solutions that have a long-term time horizon, such as a 30-year or 50-year time horizon, it can be hard sometimes to consider your individual role in this. But I really want to stress that we do have an impact as individuals, and it's why celebrating things like Earth Day, which should be every day, I completely agree, is why it's so important. So thank you so much for having me, and again, happy Earth Day.
Thank you, Catherine. That was brilliant. Yeah, and it's so true. That's what we're here to talk about today, is just the impact that we can all have together. And I think, you know, what Project Drawdown are doing, guys, is amazing. So I would, yeah, stress that you go check them out. I think that your approach to kind of like climate solutions, it's so solution driven that it's positive. You know, it's everything you guys are doing is about, all right, we understand the situation that we're in, like how can we positively like work together to get out of that? And I just think that's what everybody needs right now. That's certainly what we find, is that, yeah, our audience and the people that we speak to just are really happy to engage with solution driven content around this kind of subject. So that's great. Thank you so much. Before I share my screen again, I am just going to end this poll because I think we should have another poll. Although I'm not entirely sure how to get it. Maybe I should have just not gone with this poll thing. But we did have one. Maybe I'll just share the results there. Okay, fine. There's the results, guys. So of all of the hacks, it looks like food waste won, which is a good one. So well done. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. So the other thing that I forgot to say at the beginning that I will just mention now, although I actually can't see how I poll this, so I'm not quite sure how we will get to this, but we'll have an offer for you guys at the end as well, a buy-beat offer, and we were going to let you choose it. Hannah L, who is also here with me, I might leave the tech side of that to you just for the end of the call. So we're going to pick up briefly, Dom and I'll start sharing my screen again, and we're just going to go through some very, very high level hacks and facts, which kind of pick up on some of the stuff that Catherine talked about. We have a really in-depth deck to share with everybody after this that has quite granular, nitty-gritty hacks that you can implement in your everyday life. What I don't think is particularly useful is for us to talk through slides of loads of writing that you can just read in your own time. So what Dom and I will do is kind of highlight the areas where you can make real change, and then we'll get through that bit and on to kind of question and giving you the chance to speak to both Lucy and Catherine. So I think that's probably more interesting. But just to say that we will be following up with all of this stuff afterwards. So the really detailed slides will be able to provide you some bedtime reading, some light bedtime reading, that will, just help you kind of make some of those day-to-day choices that we've been speaking about. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen.
We haven't had any Q&A, guys, yet, so don't be shy. Everyone's so like bubbly on the chat, and then the Q&A is just tumbleweeds. So make sure that you prepare some questions because we definitely want to take advantage of our amazing speakers that we have. We are doing the Q&A after, Joanne, but if you want to pop your questions in now, then we can kind of like dive straight into them. Or you can do them when we start the Q&A, whatever suits you guys.
So the key areas that we think would be useful for you guys as our audience, and from obviously a lot of the work that Project Drawdown have done in terms of where we can actually have impact, are around food, transport, energy, fashion and beauty. We would obviously put into that as well because we are a beauty brand, and then influencing politics and kind of like driving higher level change as well. So we'll whiz through these, like we say, we'll follow up with the kind of more detail after the webinar.
Great. So in terms of energy, both Catherine and Lucy both alluded a lot to renewable energy, and I think that is the single most impactful change that you can make at speed. So switching to renewable energy, moving away from fossil fuels, saves an extraordinary amount of CO2. It's such an easy switch. And there's so many companies now that enable you to switch your energy provider in the same way that you would if you're just getting a better deal or you're moving away from your current provider, one of which is Bulb. So honestly, if there's one thing to take away from today that can be done from your laptop after this webinar, switch to renewable energy, it has such a massive impact. 247 gigatons of reduced CO2, which is just insane. And the more that collectively we invest into renewable energy, the more the government will support it and also co-invest alongside us. So it's so important. Renewable energy, move away from fossil fuels, guys.
It's so easy. It's so easy. They do everything for you. So you honestly, it's not going to take you ages. So definitely look at that. Food, we've touched on. I think food is one of the kind of like surprising pieces that has a much bigger impact than I think any of us realize. And as Catherine touched on, predominantly that is driven by what is taken in the kind of agriculture of energy impacts of the agriculture of food, as well as food waste. So I mean, there are tons of hacks around this, but the kind of like overarching theme with food is waste less, use what is already in existence or what you already have, and we'll be sharing some kind of examples of this, but yeah, basically like looking for ways to reduce your food waste is the key takeout here. And actually it's one of the things that if we're all doing it, it can have such a big impact. And then also on the kind of like using what we already have, there are so many brands at the moment who are in food and beyond, you know, beauty. We do it a lot with beauty, that are looking at kind of upcycling. So how can we take what we already have and turn it into something else? So for example, at Bybee, we use a lot of upcycled ingredients from the food industry, from the juicing industry. So we'll take strawberry seeds, for example, that would otherwise be thrown away, and we cold press them and use the oils. So getting into that mentality, getting into that circular economy mentality is so important when it comes to food, but do not underestimate the impact that food waste has on the environment.
Yeah. And again, Catherine touched on this around not, you know, we're not advocating a vegan diet where we only look at what the impact is on greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon footprint. So we're not purporting a vegan diet or encouraging people to cut out animal consumption completely. What we're just trying to highlight is that it is a fact that animal byproducts and animal products have a larger carbon footprint. So even reducing those by the smallest amount, doing your meat-free Mondays or cutting out animal products where possible can have such an immense impact. And, you know, upping your greens, using things that use climate sequestering, that's quite a mouthful, but they're innovative harvesting techniques for fruit and vegetables and things that are grown in soil that actually help to absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere. And there's a ton of businesses and companies looking at climate sequestering as a form of food harvesting. There should be some really interesting ways that you can start to find companies that are using this technique. So there's just a lot that you can do around food that doesn't mean that you just have to become vegan, and it's just becoming a little bit more educated around agriculture. It sounds a bit boring, but there's so much climate impact around agriculture and the harvesting of plant-based ingredients, but also animals and animal agriculture. It's really important, if you're committed, you know, to reducing your carbon footprint, that you look at these initiatives as well.
Transport, one that probably feels a little bit far away at the moment. So I think, you know, the takeout from transport is really going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the session. You know, when we come back to normality, whatever way, shape or form that will take, what are some of the habits that we can really ingrain, new habits that we can really ingrain into our new normality is actually quite hard to say, new normality. And I think transport is going to be a huge one. So obviously, yeah, the fact here it's 14% of global CO2, and road transport is a massive part of that. So the hacks are pretty obvious, and totally appreciate that they may not feel relevant to you right now while we are in a lockdown situation, but just something to be thinking about, you know, when we do the lockdown kind of lift slightly, what can you do around transport just to start making better choices and really thinking about the impact of your transport.
Yeah, and consumption generally, obviously we're moving where possible to a circular economy. And I think in terms of consumption across fashion, across beauty, across any consumer goods that you're buying, the circular economy model is the most sustainable. So investing in companies that have that philosophy around reducing, reusing, upcycling, using recycled materials is so important, because collectively kind of supporting those businesses and companies investing in those materials and those more sustainable circular economy structures is so important to then start building that collective change as well.
Yeah.
So fashion,
no, you go.
So fashion is obviously a massive culprit of this, and I think, you know, we've had Sarah Ditti from Fashion Revolution on the panel at a previous Susty Summit. We've done a podcast with her as well. You know, the impact of fast fashion particularly is monumental on the environment, and we're so guilty of just having this mass consumer mindset where we buy things to make ourselves temporarily feel good, and we take no accountability on what impact it has on the environment. And the global fashion industry is 1.7 billion tons of carbon a year, which is a monumental amount for something that doesn't, if you think about it, you know, how does fashion even emit carbon? We don't think of it like that because we buy it, we wear it, and then it either, you know, goes to charity or goes to the bin. But, you know, we know a lot about fashion hacks, so we won't dwell too long on this, but there are so many companies driving innovation in this space. And I think, again, you know, your wallet speaks volumes in terms of where you invest and the companies that you support in this space. And obviously reducing your reliance on fast fashion, and buying secondhand, or reducing consumption habits where possible would just be amazing.
And lastly, you can start to keep track of all of this stuff that we're talking about. And there are a number of apps now that have cropped up that allow you to track your CO2 in the same way that you track your steps, and you know, you wear your Fitbit. We should all really be getting into the habit of doing this. So the app that we would recommend is North, and it's a carbon counting app. But this, you know, these small things, these small shifts in our habits, these, you know, small like extra mile steps that we can take will all help, and everything will contribute to the collective change that we spoke about earlier. So, you know, it's kind of like, why wouldn't you? You know, it's not going to be much to your day, and this will also start to really quantify some of this stuff, because, you know, carbon, we can't touch it, we can't feel it, it's so abstract. It can feel quite difficult to understand how our actions can result in carbon emissions, which then result in climate not change emergency. There we go. So I wrote it down. I was like, remember that. So, you know, like things like these kind of tracking apps that start to really help us understand impact are just useful, because then you can start to make kind of very measured and tangible decisions that ultimately drive change. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We are going to open up for Q&A now, which is really exciting. I hope that was all useful. And again, just to reiterate, we will be sending around much more detail about kind of like much more like nitty gritty nuts and bolts of some of those hacks that we kind of glossed over just then. So we've got some stuff kicking off on the Q&A.
People took my prompt.
Yeah, it was like flashing away. Okay, so this is one for Lucy from Helen. She said, you briefly touched on this. The climate crisis is also a feminist issue. Can you talk about how it impacts women more than men? And she says, your insights are much appreciated.
Well, thank you. This is also something that Catherine, I'm sure, would want to comment on, because I think Project Drawdown is one of the strongest programs for talking about women and climate. And I'll let Catherine tell you the statistics, but the percentage of women who actually farm and produce our food worldwide is incredible. It's like, is it 70% of our food comes from women farmers?
Yep.
Yeah. Amazing. So it's a bloody disgrace that women are not being included in the conversation. I mean, we are the conversation. Well, I think you hear the phrase that women are disproportionately affected by climate change a lot. And I think that phrase is one of those phrases that distances you from the issue. Like, what does that mean if you have to unwrap it a little bit? So I first really understood that phrase because I've worked a lot with garment workers. I've been to Bangladesh quite a lot. And I saw how women in particular areas, so there's an area called the Char Islands in Bangladesh, which are flooded every year, partly through climate change, through sea level rise, but partly through floods that come down through India. And the families that live in the Char Islands, they have to literally up sticks. Sometimes their cattle are drowned, sometimes they lose everything and they have to start again. And this is like seasonal crisis and emergency. And when they move, it is basically the women that have to pick up the pieces and start again. And everything is on them, to the extent, and this is a really, really sad thing, that I saw women pulling plows because the oxen had drowned. So they were literally like being treated like beasts of burden. So there's a really extreme example of how women are disproportionately affected. But I mean, to exclude, just on a really basic top line level, to exclude 50% of people from the conversation would just be moronic anyway, wouldn't it? And I also happen to believe that when more women are involved, the energy, and I'm sorry if people are offended by this stereotype, but the energy and the solutions focus changes and is more beneficial. And I believe that fewer women are affected by negative self-image and the need to fulfill a like domineering leadership role, which I find a very narrow way of thinking, which is not helpful with a massive expansive problem like climate change. So for me, more female brains on this issue is just something that I need to hear. And I'd like to offset the rest of my answer to Catherine.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk. Well, and I want to also offset it potentially. So Catherine Wilkinson is a colleague at Project Drawdown, and she works a lot in the connection between climate and female empowerment. So I've actually shared a link to her TED Talk where she talks in more detail about this. I couldn't replicate that, unfortunately, but the role of women is significant. I think it's really integral to the question of how do we address these issues without everyone being on board. The answer is you can't, without including women as part of the solution. And also because there are so many solutions that will need greater equality to be addressed. When we ask ourselves, what do we want the future to look like? We want it to be more equitable and accessible. And that's going to include more women as part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the crisis image that we've seen a lot on social media, which is the different leaders' response to COVID-19. So there's one with just, you know, Trump and Bolsonaro and Boris Johnson and blah, blah, blah. And then there's one with the female leaders. Like in the climate emergency, which one do you want? Or we could have a mix, you know.
Yeah. Thanks both. Question from Shirley. People who are often very outspoken about climate issues could be seen as forcing their opinions on others. This can lead to a sense of guilt for others who feel like they are unable to do absolutely everything they can, and therefore leads to less engagement with better habits. What are some key communication factors, attitudes that you think are helpful in engaging others? And I think both would love to get both of your thoughts on that.
So is it the sense that of being outspoken can make people feel that can sort of alienate people to push them away?
Yeah, I guess maybe Shirley, feel free to put in the chat if this is right. But perhaps Shirley's been on the receiving end of someone that's quite passionate about climate issues and has felt like she hasn't been able to do enough and therefore has disengaged. So maybe some communication strategies on how you can communicate with someone that's really passionate about the environment and really wants to convey their concern and their anxiety around it. But telling them to kind of like calm down a little bit because it's freaking them out is what I would interpret that to be. But Shirley, feel free to clarify if that's not right.
I don't know if you can. And I do have some sympathy with this question because I know that, like, you know, initially I was quite like, when I met Greta Thunberg for the first time up a mountain in Davos at the Arctic base camp, I didn't really get it. I was like, oh, who's this kid? And wow, she's really like committed to, you know, because of the way that Greta is, there wasn't much small talk and there wasn't like loads of jokes around it. Like, she's not going to put it out there and make everything all right for everyone else. She's got something to say and she's going to say it. And I think that has become a real trend in climate communication. And it can be hard for some of us who are more naturally conciliatory. You know, believe it or not, I like to make everything all right for everyone. And I don't like anyone to feel a bit uncomfortable. And I'm that person that will fill the silence with a stupid joke or a self-deprecating remark. Whereas, you know, if we are moving into a phase when we're being incredibly truthful, I won't be, you know, like being slightly distracting at the same time is not that helpful. So I think that we have to weigh it up. Like, what's the most beneficial? Is it to try and be as appealing as we can to everybody? Or is it to speak the truth? And at the moment, I feel like the trend is to speak the truth, because that is considered a more effective way to deal with an emergency. It doesn't mean you should belittle people. It doesn't mean that you should think that people aren't trying in lots of different ways. But I do think that that is the prevailing tone of a lot of communication. That may go away, that might change. But my feeling is that if you're trying to appease everybody and you try and get the message right for everybody without offending anybody, then you're not going to say anything at all.
Yeah, leading on from that, there's a question about Sophie says, you mentioned dealing with skeptics and deniers, and she kind of says, like, what's the best way to deal with people who don't see the emergency for what it is? And then she touches on finding it hard to get through to people of her parents' generation, which was born in the 60s, 70s or older. And you spoke about that at the beginning, this kind of like gap between some of the younger people who have a strong emotional connection to what's going on at the moment versus some of older generations. Like, what do you think about that, and how does that communication start between the two generations?
It's a really good question. So I've had some really uncomfortable panel debates and interactions in the last year, and one of the ways that you can really throw a grenade into this is to bring a psychologist onto a panel. And there's a particularly wonderful woman that I've worked with called Caroline Hickman, and she does a lot of podcasts, and check them out and listen to those podcasts. And she is not at all someone, she's so empathetic. Like, even if you put her with a denialist, she runs an organization called Psychologists for Climate Action. So if you put her with a denialist, for example, she will completely like take time to understand them and be very empathetic with them on a personal level, but she won't shrink back from telling the truth about the climate emergency to appease them, because she said it won't appease them and it actually won't make them feel better. So we've had a few panels with Caroline, we've had someone from Extinction Rebellion, and we've had climate scientists mixed in with that. And we were told, three or four people in the audience, and this was a Guardian audience, asked or told women to be quiet, tried to shut them up, they tried to censor them. And actually Caroline thought this was a really good sign, because she thinks that with all her training and all her understanding of how people react to stuff, that she thinks that initial kind of verbal confrontation is someone starting to kind of open up. So there is a whole, this is why I talk about cognitive development and stuff like that. This is not just a give someone a fact, yes or no. This is a whole way of being for them, like a whole load of baggage. It might not even be about that issue. It might be about something else. And that's obviously really, really difficult to talk about. But I do feel that this crisis we're in now, and coming through this crisis, I do feel that some of, you know, what are disparagingly referred to as boomers, that boomer audience who push back will be more receptive. You're already hearing on mainstream news programs stuff like, I heard universal income, like giving everyone a certain level of income. I heard that mentioned 3 or 4 times this morning within an hour. That's never happened before. These are expansive conversations which need a mind shift, and that mind shift happens during a crisis.
Hi everyone, I'm the Sustainability Manager at IB, and I just wanted to add to Lucy's point, and that I recently found out that the fossil fuel industry have outspent climate change marketing 90%. So there's a lot of unlearning to do. So our parents' generations and older, they've been primed by marketing for a really long time, and so we have to have an element of forgiveness for their kind of quite rigid approach sometimes, but almost acknowledging and communicating that to them is a constructive way to bridge that conversation and then open it up.
The other thing that's a really good thing to do, there's a couple of things. So first of all, if you get into a science argument and someone says to you, I don't believe all that atmospheric pollution stuff, and they say this, but the climate modeling's wrong, say, oh, right, okay, but did you see that thing about the ocean? So there is incontrovertible proof that the ocean has absorbed 90% of the heat caused by humanity's greenhouse gas emissions. You know, and the ocean as a climate model doesn't have other factors. So the ocean is complex, right? And there are other variables and blah, blah, blah. But the ocean, often people will go, oh, right, yeah, they see it with the ocean. So you can actually direct them to some evidence that might be easier for them to get or less prone to lots of different variables. The other thing is there are ways of dealing with people, and Christiana Figueres is amazing at this. She negotiated the Paris Climate Agreement when it seemed like it was not possible to negotiate it. And you can sell people a version that they can get on board with. If you remember the ozone crisis, well, you're probably all too young, but the ozone crisis in the late 70s and 80s, because there seemed to be no solution. The world was going to fry because there's this big hole in the ozone layer. And what one of the architects, the scientists, did was to work with industry and go round and rapidly accelerate different types of aerosols. Okay, it's really boring. Atmospheric pollution, like who knew this stuff? And the way he did that was to go into companies and give awards to people who've never had any thanks for anything, you know, chemists who've been doing the same thing for 30 years, and to make them part of the solution and G them up and give them recognition. And by doing that, he accelerated this whole program for reforming the way that consumer goods were made and the ozone layer retreated as a problem. So there are ways of charming, rewarding, cajoling people, which maybe goes back to that first question. If you meet someone who's just like really, really hardcore, charm them out of it. I mean, we're humans.
Yeah. I'd also like to add that I find it quite interesting to figure out why people have the beliefs that they do, and perhaps really delving into that is a bit more than one could ask for. But I used to work in urban forestry, and urban forestry to me at the time seemed like a fairly straightforward approach to addressing local greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to reduce pollution, we're going to make the world a slightly better place, we're going to make it greener. But you'd be amazed at the amount of property owners who absolutely detested the idea of urban trees because they had liability issues that came as a consequence. So I think sometimes it's harder for individuals to come to terms with climate change solutions when they think about what they're losing as opposed to what they're gaining. So when we talk to property owners, in those cases, we talk about how the trees can provide shade and their air conditioning bill will be lower as a consequence, that tree-lined streets have lower speed limits as a consequence of having trees on the side, the aesthetic value, property prices, all these other things. You talk about climate change last, if ever, when you talk to a property owner.
And we did that in the UK as well, because we had about 10 years ago, a lot of the councils were chopping down really beautiful big trees because they were an insurance liability. So what somebody very cleverly did in one of the boroughs was to design a metric for valuing trees and giving them a natural capital value. And then they did a story in the press about the most expensive tree in Britain, which was this one in Mayfair, which they defined was like worth thousands and thousands of pounds, if not £1 million. And then everyone wrote this story about this tree being worth £1 million. And then every council wanted £1 million tree. I mean, you know, storytelling.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so interesting. A question from Joanne, which is quite interesting. So in just 20 years, China has managed to become the second largest CO2 cumulative emitter, only after the United States. India is on a similar trajectory in terms of CO2 emissions growth. This is as developed countries are on consistent downward greenhouse gas trends, even if it's not fast enough. For example, 12% drop in the power sector in the EU alone in 2019. How is it possible to sell in effectively changing people's entire lifestyle through food, fashion, travel, while this is happening elsewhere? And what's the best way to measure small individual collective impacts and weigh it up against Asia's upward trajectory? So that's quite a weighty question, but I think really relevant because it's something that I think about a lot as well. Is like, you know, in certain countries we're making such improvements, and then others are continuing to grow. So yeah, it would be great to get some thoughts on that. Maybe Catherine, to you first.
Sure. So I don't profess to be a master in international development or any of those areas, so I should say that first. I think this brings to light a really interesting questions about leapfrogging in development and also emissions as a whole, because when it comes to countries like Asia or even Africa, who are at different levels of industrial development, their opportunities really should be shifting to more of a renewable portfolio. And there's a larger question there about what access do they have to those types of programs or policies currently in place. I think it's easy at times to say, oh, well, China's doing this, and therefore my individual impact isn't going to make a difference, if that's what the question is implying. Our analysis does look at China and India and so forth, because we do see them being part of the solution as well. Their development will need to include some shift towards renewables. I forget the exact numbers, but I mean, China has, I believe, the largest amount of solar as well. They do have a lot of coal development too, but other countries are addressing this in different terms. And I think there's a tendency to perhaps point a finger a little bit when our own countries aren't doing enough either. If you look at perhaps the per capita emissions that come from those types of countries, because their populations are so much higher than ours, that's something to consider. But I am optimistic that I think countries, as also part of parcel of the Paris Accords, will need to address what their energy development looks like. And that also means that industrialized nations will have to participate in some of that work too.
I'm just having a quick sneaky look at the figures for renewable energy around the world. So renewable energy capacity hit record levels last year. These figures have just been released from the International Renewable Energy Agency. As you said, Catherine, China has become the biggest capacity builder of solar. The global oil market is in turmoil as well. I mean, it's a really interesting time, if I can use that. That's a real understatement. But everything is shifting, and the systems. So I'm unclear as to the exact parameters of the question in a way, because it seems to me that it's like, why should we change our system if they're not changing their system? Hello, have you seen our system? Like, why would you not want to change it if you possibly could? And we are, if one thing is happening in the last month and a bit, it is that we have seen that the big systems that we are reliant on and disempowered by are not fit for purpose. So I think it is somewhat of a privilege to be able to change those systems. And I think that we would want to change those systems. I also think that the way that this works and the global market works is that China and India, China in particular, wants to be the biggest percentage of that market. So those levers are pulled in response to what we do. We are all kind of interconnected in this. But I think now's a really good time to make those changes. I'm sorry if I'm being overly simplistic about that question, But I think that, you know, it's like crisis, opportunity, everything's up in the air. Like when we reform, do we want to try and rebuild the system and hold on to what's kind of not working? I don't think so. I think in terms of the international climate regime and international carbon targets versus national targets, I think this idea that we've done our bit and we've, you know, the UK, for example, brought in net zero laws before other countries and all the rest of it, is all very well. But I do think that we need to be really honest about how much of our footprint we have offset, particularly to China. I think it's around 13 or 14%. Now, whether that will change because everything's been thrown up in the air by the coronavirus pandemic, I'm sure it will, because consumerism has taken a massive nosedive. But we have to be really honest that historically, we've been putting a lot of our emissions into India and into China. So we have a moral responsibility to clean those up as well.
Yeah, definitely. A question from Caroline. We're probably into our last couple of questions now. We're definitely way over 50 minutes. But we'll do a couple more. This is about kind of like pushing change as individuals, but at higher levels, which you know, I think is important. So she's asked, how do you push supermarkets for change to minimize their use of plastic or fossil fuels if you don't have the opportunity to go to a kind of like more eco store yourself? But I think this is also like a question that can probably be directed more broadly, like how, as individuals, what can we be doing to push on some of the big corporates to make changes at higher levels, if there is anything that we can be doing?
I'd be happy to approach that first. So I should note as well that Project Drawdown doesn't work on the policy side of things directly, or the corporate side of things, but in my experience, I think there's an opportunity for education there. So I worked with some community groups that have really pushed for reduction in plastic bags or reduction in plastics overall in a supermarket. And I think for a company like that, perhaps who are driven by their financial interests more than their environmental interests, if you give them the numbers a little bit about what this takes or what it looks like or how it works for their image or their PR, I think there's a lot of power and potential there. I also want to touch upon perhaps something that's not in that question directly, but some of the questions I'm also seeing, that you can only do so much in the current system because it is integrated, because society has been structured a certain way. I think there's a lot of perhaps guilt that comes from not being able to do more and not being able to say buy an electric car or go organic because there are financial limitations, or if you're from California like I am, public transport doesn't really exist, so you have to drive a car to go places. I'm not saying it's not a possibility, but I think we also need to be patient and kind to ourselves within the limitations that currently exist in our societies.
I would add to that. So for example, today I've been talking to the Clean Clothes Campaign and Labour Behind the Label, that are two organisations based in Europe that fight for justice for garment workers. And at the moment, we have a real crisis in garment production countries like Bangladesh and Cambodia, because all the big brands have cancelled their orders because their sales have dropped because of the pandemic. So they're not paying for clothes that have already been made in factories, and the garment workers will starve. I'm afraid that's just the way the system works. So, you know, if I write on a thing or tweet about one of the brands, it probably won't get very far. But if I sign Labour Behind the Label's petition, then that starts a whole mechanism, and they know the route through, and they know where to apply the pressure. So I do think joining some of those organizations is a really, really important thing right now. And this goes back to a more granular approach. Like a couple of years ago, I would have thought, oh, it's a little bit nerdish to read the Clean Clothes campaign's live blog from Bangladesh every day. Now I read it every day because I need to know what they're doing, and I need to know where to put my energy. And it's about me informing myself to help them and be part of their process. And that's also what I mean about thinking a little bit more radically. So the system is broken, as Catherine says, like what would it feel like for me, who's always been a good girl and toe the line? What would it be like for me to think a bit more radically and to join in with some of these very seasoned organisers and protesters? It's quite fun.
So true. And as a final question to wrap up, I think this is quite a good one, and I'd love to hear from both of you. Sinead asks, can you share with us some more examples of good, funny, enlightening people to follow on social? So maybe both of you can wrap up with, some people that our audience can follow and engage with, any news sources that they should definitely be reading. Obviously, everyone's jumping on Project Drawdown right now, but yeah, it would be great for both of you to share, just where you get your content from, because you're both so well educated and informed about the situation as well.
I don't feel very well educated.
Well,
there's new stuff every day. I really like Heated.
Tell a good story then.
Yeah, I really like Heated, which is the newsletter from Emily Atkin. You can follow her on Twitter. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think it's just so vital. Mary Hagler, also based in America, based in New York. I think she's a brilliant, incisive commentator. My podcast with Tom Mustill, who's a natural history filmmaker. He did a film called Nature Now with Greta Thunberg and George Monbiot, which got like 60 million views and is about a natural climate solution, a tree. You'd like that, Catherine. Our podcast is called So Hot Right Now, and it's launched on the 1st of June. So please listen to that if you can bear it. And I'm always retweeting people on Twitter. So if you follow me on Twitter, I promise to give you loads and loads of different people who I follow. A lot of them are women. And I also work with Surfers Against Sewage, which is one of the big ocean charities that they run Plastic Free Communities Network UK, and loads of the big beach cleans and stuff like that.
Wonderful. Thank you also for the plug for Project Drawdown as well, Dom. There is also a wealth of information to be found on Twitter. I wouldn't necessarily point myself to be an expert. I find that the deeper I go in, the more I realize that there is no bottom when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
John Foley is the executive director of Project Drawdown. He goes by Global Eco Guy on Twitter, and he recently published an article on COVID and climate that got cited by Bette Midler, if you're interested. There's also, for some great communications folks, obviously Lucy, but also Catherine Hayhoe in the States. I believe she's in the States now. Tina Nelson, also from the Nature Conservancy, I think she's with now. And any of the advisors also for Project Drawdown. I should have a more complete list on me, but there's so much inspiration, I think, to be found.
Oh, and I would just add as well, Ellie Goulding, the singer, producer, and UN Environment Ambassador. She is really fierce on these issues and very funny. So follow her as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was brilliant, and well worth going over 50 minutes. I really hope that everyone found that interesting. So yeah, I think Dom's been popping all of those in the chat now, so get a quick screenshot while you can. But we'll follow up with all of this information. And then obviously, as we said, we'll follow up with the more detailed slides. And yeah, as Lucy and Catherine have said, feel free to tweet them directly if you have any more detailed questions. I know that we didn't get to go through all of them. Just before we go, I'm just going to put up this final poll. We'll follow up with a Susty discount, which we always do at the Susty Summit for Bybee. So you get to choose what it is. So it's either a gift with purchase where you get a product with a certain spend, or it's just a flat discount. So I'm going to quickly put that up as you guys are logging off. Please vote, and then we will send around the most popular one. And thank you for joining us over Zoom. It's like so pleased that we managed to bring it all together, and there weren't any technical hitches, which is great. And yeah, we just really appreciate everyone spending their Earth Day evening with us. And yeah, feel free to reach out to Dom and I as well. We're Clean Beauty Insiders, or Bybee, yeah, and we'll come back to you. So yeah, really enjoyed having you all with us this evening. Thank you so much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
There's the poll. Oh, the poll's here. The poll has arrived.
And it's only going to be up for 15 or so seconds before I end this meeting. And
everyone, please vote quickly.
Yeah, it's neck and neck. No, it's not.
Thank you to everyone for your lovely comments in the chat as well. It's again so great that we were able to connect with so many people outside of our usual London cohort. Maybe we'll look at doing more Zoom Susty Summits. It was a great success, hopefully, and it was absolutely a really great way to share information, having the chat functions and the Q&As. So thank you so much for everyone for being so engaged and so involved.
Yeah. So ending poll, and I'm ending meeting now. So thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye.